Hello, everyone, and welcome to this time of worship and Bible study sponsored by the First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park, California. I want to welcome each of you today, whether you are a member of our church or a friend or relative who's watching this video, or if you just stumbled upon this video on the internet by chance. We are so happy, so delighted that you're joining with us today. I've been preaching through the third chapter of Ephesians lately, and we've come to this part of the chapter where we're going not just verse by verse, but almost phrase by phrase, because there's so much to unpack here. Our key verse for today is verse 17, but just to put it into the context of this, really it's a prayer that Paul prays in chapter 3. Let's go back and read verses 14 through 17, even though we've already looked at 14 through 16. But to put it in context, let's read verses 14 through 17, but we're going to focus today on verse 17. Paul prays this: "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love," and then he goes on, we'll look at that section next week, verses 18 and 19, as he talks more in depth about the love of God. Today, our focus is verse 17. The message is entitled, "What Happens When Jesus Dwells in Your Heart?" Now, this verse is very closely tied to verse 16. And just a reminder of what we looked at last week in verse 16, this part of Paul's prayer was a prayer that the power of God and the strength of God would be a part of every Christian's life, and that as we face the challenges of life, we would rely upon God's power. And you remember we said that we get our English word dynamite from that Greek word. It's power that is able to overcome all resistance, and that we would rely upon God's strength. And that word strength means to fortify or to brace, as if braced for a storm. And now Paul continues in verse 17 with that idea. And I want to point out two phrases in particular to you today as we look a little more in depth at this verse. First of all, Paul prays that Christ would dwell in our hearts through faith. Now, the idea of Jesus being in our hearts, we're very comfortable with that idea. We talk about that all the time, don't we? We compare conversion to inviting Jesus into your heart. Surprisingly, this is the only place in the New Testament where that phrase occurs. So obviously this is a really important verse. But I want to point out to you that in this instance, Paul is not talking about conversion. He's not talking about inviting Jesus into your heart to be saved. Paul writes this letter to a Christian church. They're already saved. They are already Christians. So he's not talking about inviting Jesus into your heart. He's talking about making Jesus at home there. That word dwell that he uses in verse 17, that Christ would dwell in your hearts through faith. It's in Greek, it's a compound word. And, we have compound words in English. It's where you put two words together to make one word: campground, barnyard, airfield, and so on. This is a compound word, two words together to make one. And the two words are to settle down and permanently. So when you put those two words together, it makes one word that means to settle down permanently. So he's not talking about inviting Jesus into your heart here. He's talking about Jesus feeling at home there, about Jesus being comfortable in your heart. Now, being that that's the case, a good question for us to ask ourselves is, what is it that makes Jesus feel at home in my heart? And is there something that would make him not feel at home there? When we were getting ready to sell our house, we decided to invite a realtor to come over and, look at the house and the property and let us know what we needed to do to get the house ready to sell. We'd lived there almost 27 years, so you kind of get used to whatever defects it has and problems it has and all that. So he came and walked through the house and through, around the property and all that, and spent a couple of hours, and he came up with a list of things that he wanted us to do to get the house ready for new people to live in it. But I want you to see here that Paul only has one thing on this list of the things that would make Jesus feel uncomfortable in our hearts. There's only one thing. Did you notice what it is? It's there in verse 17. It's a lack of faith. He prays that Jesus would dwell in our hearts through faith. The one thing that makes Jesus not feel comfortable in our hearts is a lack of faith. The Bible word for faith it's a very profound word. We think of faith as believing, and that's certainly part of faith, but the Bible word actually comes from an ancient word, even older than the Bible, older than the New Testament. Comes from a word that means to bow down in submission as before a king. The idea is of being so overwhelmed in the presence of a king that one is brought to his knees. Now, thinking of this verse in the context of verse 16, where Paul talks about the strength of God, which braces us and fortifies us for all of life's challenges, and the power of God that can overcome resistance. What is faith in that context? Faith is relying upon God's power and God's strength. Let me give you an example to show you the difference between these two things. Not living by faith, not walking by faith would look like this. A problem comes into your life and you fall apart. You lose control. You sink in to despair. You act like you're all alone in this problem, or you act like that God is powerless to do anything about it. Your lack of faith allows your problems to overwhelm you. That's when we're not walking by faith. That's when we're not allowing Jesus to dwell in our hearts by faith. What would it look like when we are walking by faith, when we do allow Jesus to dwell, not just invite him in, but to dwell in our hearts by faith? A problem comes into your life and you rely on God's power to withstand it. You remember that God's power can overcome all obstacles. You rely upon God's strength to fortify you and brace you. And you think to yourself, I am a child of the King. There is nothing that God cannot do. And I will rest in God's power as I take on this challenge. That's what Jesus dwelling in your heart through faith looks like. Notice that in both examples, both people in our examples have problems. The difference is, and the only difference is, one trusts in God by faith and the other does not. So that's the first thing that Paul says here. He prays that Jesus would dwell in our hearts through faith. If you want Jesus to dwell in your heart, you must live and walk by faith. Now here's the second thing he says in verse 17. He prays that when Jesus dwells, or he says that when Jesus dwells in our heart through faith, we will be rooted and grounded. And he adds in love, and we're going to get into that idea more in next week's sermon. So when Jesus dwells in our hearts through faith, we are rooted and grounded. I've read that verse a number of times until it dawned on me. He's using analogies from two different spheres, two different realms, agriculture and architecture. Rooted is an agricultural term, right? We all know what roots are, but what do roots do? Because he's talking about us now being rooted in Christ. Well, roots give stability. When a plant or a tree sinks down roots, the tree can withstand great stress because it has sunk roots into the ground. And roots give nourishment. Without deep roots, a plant or a tree would die. Have you ever been, those of you who live in California, have you ever been up to the Santa Ynez Valley east of Santa Barbara? It's a magnificent area, and some of the most prized grapes in the world are grown there. Mary and I drove up in that area once, and we learned that a lot of the vineyard owners, the grape growers there, because that is a very arid area, like most of California. It doesn't get a lot of rain. It's dry. And so you would think that they just have to constantly irrigate and water the grapes, but they don't. In fact, a lot of them practice what they call dry farming. They don't water at all. Because what happens is the vines sink down roots deep, deep into the soil until they find hidden resources that can't be seen with the eye. Do you get what Paul is saying here? That when you are rooted in Christ, you will sink down roots deep into hidden resources. And when the storms of life come, you will stand strong because you are rooted in Christ and you can tap into those hidden resources. Then he says also that we're grounded in Christ. Now, this is an architectural term. It refers to the foundation. It describes what lies beneath or underneath and refers to something that is secure and permanent. The picture is of a house or a life in Paul's mind, which is so firmly fixed on a secure foundation that it withstands the storms of life. I grew up in New Orleans, and my family, we lost our house in 1965 because of Hurricane Betsy. It was blown away, water damaged and damaged by the wind. And so my parents built a new house there right on the place where the old house had been. But they did something, I'll never forget this. They drove deep wood pilings into the ground before they built a new house, before they poured the foundation. Now, those of you who grew up in that area, you know that the water there, the whole city is built on, marshland or a riverbed. The soil is loose. It's marshy. It's, it's what the Bible would call sinking sand, right? So wood pilings, and these things must have been 30 or 40 feet long. They were driven with a crane, driven deep into the ground until the pilings reached solid soil way underneath the ground, the topsoil. And then the foundation was poured on top of that. Every architect will tell you that the secret to every building is the foundation. There's even a saying in architecture, if you don't go deep, you can't go high. Paul is picturing here a life that is built on the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. I couldn't help but think of the hymn, The Solid Rock, this week as I was writing this sermon. I've been singing it to myself a lot. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. That's what Paul is picturing here. A life that is rooted and grounded in Jesus Christ. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Now you may be thinking, well, how do I do all this? How do I remember all this? Because I want to remember to root myself, and I want to remember to ground myself. I want to point out something to you. It's a key to understanding this passage. And to do it, I'm going to have to give you a brief grammar lesson. We're going to go back to our high school grammar class for just a moment because it truly is important. This phrase, to be rooted and grounded, is written in the passive voice. Now, remember from your grammar class, the passive voice is it's not something that you do. It's something that's done to you. It's something that happens without your action. The active voice is when you do something. And when Paul says that Christ would dwell in your heart through faith, that idea of faith, that's written in the active voice. That's something you do. God requires faith on your part. That's the part that you have to do. But rooted and grounded are written in the passive voice. In other words, this isn't something you do, it's something that God does for you. In other words, when you allow Jesus to dwell in your heart through faith, God will see to it that your life is securely rooted and grounded in Christ. When your life is rooted and grounded in Christ, you will withstand the storms of life. At our house in Whittier, in the yard, there was a stump in a little garden right by the garage. And my wife wanted me to dig that stump up because she wanted to plant some flowers there, and she felt like the stump was, it was right in the middle of the garden, and she couldn't plant her. We had already chopped the tree down, but we couldn't get that stump out. So she wanted me to remove that stump so she could plant her flowers. So I went out there with my axe, and I hacked and hacked with that axe, and that thing would not come up. And I tried an electric saw on it, and that didn't work. My wife, on the advice of a neighbor, drilled holes into the stump and poured some kind of tree poison into it. Didn't budge. Nothing happened to that stump. I went back there with the axe again and, dug out all the dirt around it to expose the roots even more, and hacked on that thing with an axe. Nothing. We finally gave up. We could not do any damage to that stump. I thought a lot about that stump this week as I was writing this sermon, because for me it was like a perfect picture of a Christian facing the storms of life, a Christian whose life through faith in Jesus Christ is grounded and rooted deep, deep in the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. And when the storms of life come, he is safe and secure, unshakable and unmovable. That's what happens when you allow Jesus to dwell in your heart through faith. And so focus on that, having faith in Jesus, not just the faith to invite him into your heart, but the kind of enduring, lasting faith that makes him at home there, that makes him comfortable there, that allows him to dwell there. And when you do that, God will see to the rest. God will see to it that you are rooted and grounded in the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. All right, next week we're going to continue in this passage, and we're going to look at what Paul has to say about the magnificent and awesome love of God. I hope you'll be here for that. I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Until that time, may God bless and keep you.